to the cloud. Okay, got it. Great. Okay, and so over to the presentation itself. And for those of you who don't want to stare at just the slides the entire time, there is a way to see the speaker. I think it's called speaker view. You can click on it in the top right. And there's even, I think it's 3 dots. You can drag my face over and make it bigger. So you can see me along with the slides, because I do actually pause on some of these slides for quite a while. Without further ado, and I'm going to pull this shade across. Got a glare. Okay. So I'm super excited to share all that I've been researching and learning recently in light of, like I said, Joe's partnership. I'm really starting to see emerging possibilities and developments in this quickly evolving world of regeneration. I mean, this is really just such an exciting time for us to be here, worrying, but also exciting. It's my intent to share specifically the Commonland model, more of it. I'm sure that many of you are becoming familiar with it if you weren't already, because of Joe's many great updates. He sets a pretty high bar, but hopefully we'll dig in a little bit deeper into particularly these core teams, which I think is such an important concept. So Commonland's model, along with several case studies that I've been reading about, are really demonstrating to me the possibilities for landscape scale regeneration and bioregionalism, and how that's greatly increased when we focus on the facilitation of grassroots emergence and a strong grassroots base that's guided by these models, these planetary organizations that are developing common visions and common language. And they've also done this in other places before. And so, like Meady mentioned, I think in our last Wednesday session, a lot of this is about meeting in the middle, or maybe that was in Friday's exploratory session. And so I'll also touch on how this might sort of give us some inspiration for how a Bioregional Weavers Guild might add value to what Commonland has created and what other larger landscape scale regeneration organizations are doing. And so, intro to Commonland. They have a quote on their website that I think really beautifully sums up their perspective. And so I'm just going to go ahead and read that. Today, many people are disconnected from nature and unable to see the connection between healthy landscapes, a stable climate, food security, and their own well-being. We see this loss of connection and inner purpose as a severe threat from landscape degradation, as landscapes are the mirror of our soul. Remember that. I'll bring that up a couple more times. We believe that by making people aware and engaging them, a sense of hope and purpose will return. We pursue this by deeply understanding local and indigenous wisdom and ownership, grasping the meaning of long-term commitment from governments, companies, investors, and taking the time for inner reflection. And so, end quote. Just want to emphasize how much that's all about connection. It's a theme that we've been exploring in the Bioregional Catalyst, hence Weavers, from pretty much day one. One of the central goals of Willem and Commonland has been to find a simple and maybe I'd say essential model. That might be going a little far, but a deeply principled model for regenerating that local inhabitants, farmers, bankers and financiers, and ecologists alike can all understand and all get behind. And sorry if the computer is shaking a little bit. This is on my lap. I kind of just found a place to give this. I'm in my mom's house right now. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Willem Verweerde. I always call him William on accident. I'm not used to the name Willem, which is probably why I stumbled over the name. But Willem Verweerde, very inspiring guy. I don't mean to put him on a pedestal here, even though he is pretty awesome. But I just want to ground this story in lived experience. Really, it's much easier to understand Commonland and where it comes from through an understanding of Willem and his background. And so he was able to create a deep connection, or a deep connection emerged in him with nature as a very young boy. It's a really personal story, and I heard it in an interview he did with Daniel Christian Wall. I'm going to go ahead and link to that interview in the chat once I get a moment. I don't have the link at the ready, but I'll also post it in the recording that I post in Bioregional Catalyst or Earth Regenerators. And I'll just say, as a little teaser, He began an important dialogue with nature as a really young boy. It was a really formative experience. So he comes from that background. And when he was a little older, he studied tropical ecology and environmental science in Amsterdam and Bogota. And since studying in Bogota 35 years ago, he's since returned to Colombia, not only when he went to see Joe a couple weeks ago, but before that. And he traveled around the Andes in places where he had once seen forested areas and biodiversity. And upon his return, he saw an awful lot of deforestation, and much of the land had been converted into industrial agriculture. And a quarter, he says, Commonland says this often, a quarter of the planet has been converted, integrated in this way. And so Willem saw that this is what our planetary ecological systems are becoming: degraded, mechanized for production, true nature forgotten, replaced by the pursuit of quick financial returns. And then, do you remember that quote that I suggested we all remember from the quote in Commonland's website, that landscapes are the mirror of our soul? So after studying, he spent many years working at the International Union for Conservation of Nature. He actually ran an ecotourism business for like 8 years directly after studying, but then he moved on to the IUCN, at one point serving as director, maybe of just Holland. I wasn't able to find that information out. I don't know if it was the entire organization, but regardless, towards the end of his time there, he started to look into large-scale restoration projects to try to understand what made them possible. Of course, he looked at the Loess Plateau. If you're unfamiliar with that case, check out the documentary by John D. Liu. It's one of the most inspiring things around. So basically a little bit about the story of the Loess Plateau. The Chinese government was mobilized to address deforestation in an area that's the size of France, because so much of the territory there was eroding into the Yellow River and causing chaos downstream. And then obviously there was a lot of poverty in the area. And so they were able to bring together the resources and commit the amount of time to see this huge area reforested. And they applied rigid protocols for locals. And over the course of 25 years, they've been able to reforest an area the size of Belgium, which to this date is the largest reforestation project in the modern world anyways, that humans managed, I suppose. Although I don't know if that's true exactly. But when you dig deeper anyways into the Loess Plateau case, and you look for the benefits that were created along the way, there's more jobs, educational systems emerged, farm income tripled, erosion was abated, amongst countless other benefits. And naturally, as somebody who is interested in large-scale landscape restoration, Willem wondered what we could learn from the Loess Plateau and the case there that could be applied to large-scale land regeneration projects elsewhere. And so Willem then took a year sabbatical to try to understand why investable landscape restoration projects are desperately needed but non-existent. And so he was able to get a little bit of financial backing and started traveling the world. He went to New York, he went to London, Frankfurt, speak with people in the finance industry. And the responses were all similar, that the Loess Plateau case is beautiful. They love to see landscape scale regeneration, but it's high risk, offers low returns, and there's no exit strategy. And a little bit condescendingly, they also often said, plus, Willem, you're an ecologist. Well, what do you know about finance? But Willem was learning some things about finance. He learned that finance views land-based investments in a couple of ways: return on investment per hectare and the amount of risk associated. And this very narrow perspective results in the fragmentation of landscapes, taking something whole, dividing it into its parts so it can be understood. Return and risk can be understood. And returns could go to individuals or groups of people. And so you're dividing up parts and extracting. And this has led to so much of the collapse in vital systems that we see today. And so as an ecologist, Willem clearly saw that we need a holistic way of relating to landscapes, one where everything is connected to ecology, including business and finance. And he saw that there was a need for an essential and simple model that we could share across the planet so that people from all backgrounds could see the possibilities and could adapt and learn together. And And so he continued his travels around the world, went to highly degraded landscapes to speak with inhabitants. And in every case, he saw a recurring pattern in the form of 4 losses. And those 4 losses are loss of biodiversity, loss of jobs, loss of economic activity, and loss of meaning and purpose. And if this looks familiar, it should. It was the inspiration for the 4 returns. He flipped that. He said that the essential functions of landscapes need to be connected and stewarded at scale. That's simply how nature works. River systems need to be seen, understood, and stewarded in their entirety. Willem had found a simple and compelling narrative that opened the door for the common language and the common vision he was looking for around landscape scale regeneration. And if we can clearly see the damage we do by fragmenting landscapes, we can clearly, hopefully, see the potential in regeneration or for regeneration when we integrate landscapes. And then instead of the 4 losses, because of return on investment per hectare, we can reveal the 4 returns per landscape. And I don't know if you just noticed that, but I moved inspiration to the top because Willem noticed that it is inspiration that's the most important of the returns. It's the fuel. It's what mobilizes people. It gives people meaning and purpose where once it was all lost. And once again, landscapes are the mirrors of our souls. Seeing our landscapes healed heals us in a very real sense. And so Commonland's first decade, he didn't stop at that year's sabbatical. That was in 2011, 2012. We'll fast forward to today. He took that model and he tested it on the ground to see if it actually could enable landscape scale regeneration or people coming together around very large, complex projects with long time frames. And as of August this month, Commonland is working and consulting with 16 landscapes, the latest addition being our friends down in Barichara. Hey, Joe. Hey, Penny. And in the last decade, they've done some incredible work. They've helped to transform countless hectares, assisted, supported 2 million hectares in Spain alone, I believe. But arguably the most significant thing that they've done up to this point is all that they've learned along the way and all that they're sharing now. They provide the world with a model that can be replicated, shared language and story to help us to better communicate and adapt together. Another thing that they've learned is that they've learned that representing and giving voice to landscapes themselves and various landscape functions like river systems provides a connection and relationship to place that's able to convene diverse stakeholders or inhabitants from across entire territories. Joe has mentioned this in his updates a couple of times. It's a beautiful insight. Michael Dowd, I don't know how many of you are fans or followers of Michael Dowd, but he often says that the greatest stewards in history were indigenous groups who were accountable to the future. And they were also ones that animated parts of their landscape so they could relate to them. It's a very interesting insight. Another lesson that they've learned is that there's also clearly a need to no longer replicate more colonial and extractive ways of doing things. And here's a quote from Commonland's executive summary to demonstrate what they mean by that. Successful holistic landscape restoration is a long-term endeavor that only works if it is grounded and owned by the people in the landscape. Switching from top-down to democratic, inclusive, bottom-up approaches to ecosystem restoration is a critical success factor. And so in order to be facilitators of grassroots emergence, they've partnered with Theory U and the Presencing Institute, which is a very interesting organization in and of themselves. It's some of the next research that I'll be doing and people I'll be trying to reach out to. Empowering sovereignty for communities to guide their own development is the purpose of Theory U and the Presencing Institute, and it's something that is very important to Commonland. So turning focus back on a Bioregional Weavers Guild and ER, Joe has said that one of our great challenges is finding ways to catalyze bioregional learning and group formation all over the planet. And there's just so much that we can learn from Commonland. And one of the things is the scale that's necessary, really big, which there was a little bit of conversation in the comments below this post early this morning or late last night. I didn't exactly see when, I was up early, about scale, a bit of wariness and trepidation about it. But I think that as is the case with so many things that grow organically, there's something smaller that we can focus on, that we can organize around that is based on relationships. And I think that all of this is actually still about relationships. And so moving on to this model, This is one that Joe made, actually, inspired by conversations he's had with Willem. And I think it helps us to understand a little bit more of how the Bioregional Weavers Guild may offer support or add value. And so to better understand that, we'll take a look at this more deeply. It's a model that came from Commonland's 15 landscapes and last decade of experience, focuses on the really long time frames, 20 plus years, oftentimes many more years than 20. Willem settled on 20 because it's generational and things can really get started at that point in time. And then investment level, revealing how and when to expect the emergence of a regenerative economy or regenerative infrastructure, however you want to term it, but also government support and local businesses being able to see and understand what's going on and jump in and lend their helping hand as well. And so what I want to point out here that relates to us is the critical role of the core teams. And Joe, this is also something Joe's talked about. They're a group of like 15 to 20 individuals who hold the process and manage the risks over a course of like it says here, at least 20 years. And without a core team, developing an integrated landscape plan and its implementation are simply not possible. And the more I've listened to Willem, I've heard him reference this a couple different times. Any big complex project is just not possible, particularly when there's multiple stakeholders, if there's not a core team that holds that over a long period of time. So I think this is a really important pattern of managing complexity, is having this core team. And so I think it's something that we can kind of dig into in the Bioregional Weavers Guild and see if it's something that we can, as Bioregional Weavers and Bioregional apprentices, begin to use as a wayfinder. And so the formation of core teams. Are you someone who would love to commit 20 plus years of your life to the regeneration of your landscape? Or do you know somebody that would? It doesn't necessarily have to be you either. And so I think that we have a really interesting opportunity to also go along with Bioregional and our friends down there as they're forming their core team in the Ecoversity, provide us an opportunity to learn about this in real time, to speak and collaborate with the weavers down there as they begin to better understand their own roles and they find ways to describe them. And then also there are, a growing number of weavers worldwide who've been part of core teams in other landscapes that are working with Commonland. And might we work with them as well? So I think a lot of very interesting possibilities here. And then in order to understand a little bit more of the roles of the core teams, I wanted to just go through the 5 process elements. I think we're about 10 minutes left on this presentation for those of you who may be yawning or ready to talk about this. I'm going to go through these 5 process elements. We'll reflect on what core teams might do for each, and then we'll just wrap up with a few other things. So if you're familiar with the model, you've got landscape partnerships being sort of the core of it all, the base, the center. And then from there, you begin to develop a shared understanding. Those 2 things really are reminiscent of Story of Place to me. And then you develop collaborative vision and planning, take action, and then monitoring and learning, which really is reminiscent of the roles that a bioregional learning center would serve to me. But we'll get into that a little bit more. So landscape partnership. Interested rights holders and stakeholders come together for dialogue and action in a common platform. So the outcomes of this are a carefully crafted stakeholder map of key and diverse stakeholders from across the territory, and then the establishment of the platform. So what would the core team do? What would their roles be in forming a landscape partnership? I think first and foremost, as Joe has mentioned, speaking for the landscape, I think that is a profound insight that I want to keep hammering on, animating the landscape, being able to open the door for more and deeper relationships with it. And that has a lot to do with this second bullet here, cultivating identity and purpose. And one of the things I really got excited about is this idea of vision quests. I think they'd be part of a larger Story of Place process potentially. I saw a mention of these vision quests somewhere on Commonland's website or in some of their literature. And what they said about it is they are short events that open people's minds, hearts, motivation. They're really like a bioregional awakening to reveal ecological connectivity, blind spots, concerns in the community and the local ecology. And so I just think that those would be so fun to organize, to host, to attend, and really a powerful tool for building coherence, identity, and purpose. And so the next point here is exploring the core team's social niche in the community. This is another thing that was an inspiration from Joe. He talked about the value of thinking like an ecologist, of seeing our social systems like ecologies, and what would a core team's role be, looking at it through that lens. How would we then relate to other teams? How could we then see how to use pro-social principles and design towards succession? One example is trust building, which is, I've heard, the hardest thing in all of this is building trust over time. And really that's like adding carbon to the soil for the mycelium to then grow. So I think thinking like ecologists is something that all of us can aspire towards to create more possibilities for bioregionalism. Also, like I mentioned, careful stakeholder mapping and invitation. This is where we can sort of flex some of our social system mapping muscles, although they may be a little atrophied at this point, but begin lifting those weights again, so to speak. Then also establishing the platform for engagement and collaboration. This is big. How do you do that? How has Barichara done that? How have all the other landscapes done that? You're really designing for group cohesion and capacity building. And then these last two bullets are flipped. Trust building, I think, is part of establishing that platform still. And I think that's a big part of that is introducing pro-social and theory U. And then, maintaining that energy and enthusiasm all the time, making it fun, making it light. Enthusiasm is so important. And just sort of an aside, I just heard this morning that the etymology of the word enthusiasm is with God, which is kind of interesting. Maybe just a little coincidence there. So the next process element or landscape process, which I've seen Joe refer to it as, is shared understanding. This is where partners exchange information, discuss perspectives, achieve understanding of local conditions, challenges, opportunities, and really importantly, each other. It can include an analysis of natural and social returns, investigation of the underlying drivers and causes of economic, environmental, and social degradation. I'm thinking story of place here as a way to really make all of this very compelling and give people something to really deeply relate to. The phrase story of place seems to have a lot of resonance with people. And so I do want to just point out that this stage is so important for stakeholders to come together to understand each other's motivations, their limits, build trust, which allows so much more efficient problem solving later on in the process. And also revealing the needs and desires of the landscape, as I mentioned before. I've mentioned vision, quest, and story of place also before. And then you're beginning to see into people's aspirations. I think they begin to naturally come out. What do inhabitants want the territory to be? And also this is an opportunity for us to educate each other on what an ecosystem is, thinking like ecologists, thinking like climatologists, and then relationship building. I mentioned that already before, in building trust. But also, pro-social comes in here too, because a lot of people are going to be unfamiliar with this sort of process. It's going to be the first time that they are really coming together at a community scale and speaking about the entire landscape and seeing, seeing things beyond their own needs potentially, and trying to work with others. And I think people are going to warm up to that process at different speeds. So I think pro-social facilitation and mediation is going to be big at this stage, and throughout all of these. But I just wanted to point out that specific case. And another thing that Commonland mentioned that's really valuable is to identify key stakeholders in the community who have a lot of respect and trust and a great track record already. And if you can, win their enthusiasm for the project, then you can really go a long ways. It's one of the things they've learned that is worth pointing out. And also, like I mentioned before, I really think this is the green shoots of a bioregional learning center as well. So collaborative planning and landscape vision, halfway through almost, these 5 processes anyway. This is the exchange of information and reaching shared understanding, leads to a landscape vision and collaborative development of an action plan. So we've gone through the first 2, which has opened the door for this to be possible. And so the outcomes are the vision, the action plan, the zoning plan, which I won't talk about in this presentation, but it's an important concept, allows us to see the landscape in ecological terms, see the natural zone, the combined zone, and the economic zone, and understand how it all pieces together. But perhaps we'll dive into that deeper in a later presentation. But for now, the core team roles in this particular process, facilitating dialogue and workshops for the landscape to create a vision and then a plan. Really important here, identify, quantify, and balance the expected for returns. It's so important for this process to include everybody. Also wanted to point out that this process, something I just missed, I just noticed that this is also the process where we're beginning to understand what the territory is, understanding the bioregion, if it will, and its boundaries. And so, like I mentioned just a moment ago, we're introducing spatial planning with the 3 zones, we're prioritizing actions, we're thinking about prototyping so that we're not going to scale or trying to go to scale right away. We're testing things in context. And also, since awful lot of people on the planet have never seen landscape scale regeneration before, we're bringing in case studies and we're trying to relate to other landscapes that are doing this, that are perhaps further along than us, for guidance and inspiration, which is really essential, really helps out a lot. So number 4, effective implementation. This is where we do the thing. And we maintain attention on collaborative commitments, transparency, and then we secure financing that can make it all happen. So the outcome is an investment plan, actions funded, successful implementation of those actions. And so the core team roles for this, implementing the plan is the hardest part. It's really important to show successful milestones to demonstrate the effectiveness and the benefits of working at landscape scale. A realistic landscape investment plan is needed. And if it's carefully planned, it can bring a lot of money in to result in a lot of regeneration. And some practical steps are to, like I mentioned before, prototyping, testing things in context before it scales, to win over the trust of stakeholders and funders alike. And remember that this is always going to be about learning through doing. And Joe also mentioned something that I think is useful to bring in at this point in time. Is going to be something that's going to be that the core team is going to need to keep in mind throughout the entire process, or all 5 processes, but I want to mention it here. The core team is responsible for holding community decision-making and sovereignty to ensure that outside funding doesn't distort concerns, needs, aspirations of the landscape and the community, simultaneously establishing clear communication, coherence, and trust with outside donors. Investors are going to want to know what's happening as much as possible. And this is going to help to maintain the integrity of those relationships. So core teams are going to be responsible for that particular balancing act. Also wanted to mention that pro-social facilitation, again, is going to be really important at this stage as the territory navigates complex real-world challenges. And then last but not least, monitoring and learning. So this is where stakeholders undertake monitoring and adaptive management and accountability, outcomes being a system, monitoring system and learning strategy, bioregional learning centers. For those of you who've been participating in campfires for a long time, I see this as something similar to the yarn, like how do we come together and continually make sense of what we're seeing and move forward together. This is a very important step. And oftentimes it's overlooked, these subsequent rounds of dialogue, knowledge exchange, and learning. Also, Commonland has noticed that measuring and communicating progress really helps to maintain interest, reassure government, donors, and others, focuses the team on delivering results, and catches problems, hopefully fast enough to adapt. Okay, just a few more slides. How can the Bioregional Weavers Guild serve in the formation and development of core teams? Well, I don't know. This is an inquiry, but I got a couple ideas. Just want to throw them out there. I haven't spent a whole lot of time thinking about this particular slide, but just food for thought. We could put together learning journeys where a few weavers in different landscapes actually step through one of these key process elements or landscape processes. To use landscape partnership as an example, we could see if we could get a small core team together that begins to speak for and represent the landscape. It's doing social system mapping, identifying key and diverse stakeholders, inviting them into conversations, seeing if the core team can build and beginning to have those initial conversations. I think that would be fascinating for us to do that together. I don't know how feasible it is, but it's just something I'm thinking about right now. Another thing is, so much of the challenge of getting the core team up and running is getting it funded. And so how can we use our particular unique platform on Earth Regenerators to explore this theme? And then lastly, I just want to point out that, there's probably other organizations that are already doing similar things. There's an organization that's associated with the 4 Returns or with Commonland called 4 Returns Labs. I haven't really been able to figure out exactly what they do, but I've heard reference to them several times. And I kind of get the idea that they are doing something similar to us. And Commonland does have a community online that offers courses and things like that. So perhaps there's opportunities for us to take a wide view and figure out how we can collaborate and add value rather than compete. So the road ahead, and this is kind of personal, but we're all in relation together. So I think this, I'll loop you in whenever it makes sense. Some of these refer to the bioregional catalysts. So first I got to heal my body. You all know, or most of you know that, I've been on a long healing journey, and I'm finally experiencing a lot of progress. I got to, be diligent about keeping that up. And sometimes that means listening to my body when I'm tired and working short days. So while I'll continue to be diligent and always step forward down this road, it might not be that fast. And I would love more collaboration as well. But I just wanted to point that out. I feel like it's important for me to lead with that when there's just, a lot of excitement brewing. Also form relationships with people in Commonland, the Presencing Institute, 4 Returns Labs, and others, Regen Network. Maybe we can invite people to come speak or attend our workshops. And then speaking of our workshops, I want to keep developing the bioregional group incubators. Maybe we call that core team incubators. I don't know, sorry, throwing around so many different names, but other workshops as well, story of place, bioregional mapping. And then also I still intend to head down to Barichara. There's just so much to learn from the core team there. I'm just so excited. And I've been promising hugs to Penny and Joe and several other people down there for a long time. And then I need to find myself some funding at some point in time to keep going, and willing to get pretty creative with that. If I got to get a job, I got to get a job, but also wanted to throw that in there briefly. And that is the end. I hope you're all still with me. Questions, comments. I'm really excited to talk about this. Thanks. You guys are too kind. We still have everyone. Thanks. I didn't scare anybody away. That's good news. Claire.
Wow. Yeah. Oh my God. Thank you so much. That is, yeah, I'm just so grateful to you for pulling that together. And I think one of the things that, that kept jumping out to me, Benji, was, oh my God, you're saying all the things so in such a coherent way. It makes so much sense. And I've been trying to do this for, in integrating all that kind of thinking and way more into the projects I've been doing, and just how challenging it is. Like people I often thought would get it, and how much they resisted that. And just sort of, so there's the affirmation that's like, oh my God, it's all there, and somebody else is saying it. So I just to sort of put that there. The other thing, maybe I'll leave that there. I do have another comment that just that sprung to mind, but there's lots of other people, their reflections. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. Yeah, I'll just briefly say, I mentioned early on in the presentation that's largely what Willem's been looking for is a way to share this story. And that's a big part of why I've been so excited about this. Not only, in addition to the fact that he's working with Joe and Barichara, that's just so exciting as well. But that there is a vision that I feel like I could share with anybody. And I think that the importance of that can't be overstated. Yeah. Joe or Penny or Elise. I don't know, maybe it's Elise.
It's mostly Elise, but a little bit me too. I want to give a quick personal update on Willem, because he invited me to share, and then a comment about the core teams and what we're doing in Barichara as just an example, because I think every place will have its own different example. So the personal update is that Willem is actually in a personal family crisis right now. And so I wanted to just invite everyone to open their hearts that last weekend, his son, who's 21 years old, had an undiagnosed heart problem that no one knew about and is now in a coma and could die at any moment. And it's been this terrible ordeal for the last several days. And so Willem just sent me a message this morning and letting me know that was happening. So I just wanted to, as I was hearing you celebrating this incredible human being, for us to hold where his family is right now. So just wanted to name that because that felt really important. And that relates in a way to the way these core teams work in practice, which is, as we talked about in the most recent learning journey, for those of you who were there for that, there are several ways to understand what it means to be a weaver in a social context. You can be the one who is weaving. You can be one of the threads that is being woven. You can be a piece of the tapestry that feels the presence of the rest of the tapestry that is being woven by others, or that is being woven by the entire process without any personified weaver. And there are more ways. But just to say that it's so dynamic and evolutionary, the way that this actually works, that any attempt to describe the functions of a core team will run the risk of sounding more static than it actually is. And not that you did that, I just wanted to name that because this is so important. So for example, the way that we sense with our bodies into what is needed and what is emerging as individuals and as groups is so subtle in relation to how the members of the core team have worked through their own capacities to relate. And that this is a really basic element, because the core team is not like there's a process happening and the core team holds it, which is what holding the process as a frame. I know I use that phrase, so I'm actually unpacking my own frame. I like to set up frames and then break them to basically give a simplified beginning and then get more nuance. Is holding the process is like Willem holding his son right now. Holding the process is an intimacy and an integration and an inseparability and an intimacy. So the team that's holding the landscape is the landscape. And they come deeply to realize that they can't be separate from it. And that's why they can sustain years and years of uncertainty and difficulty. And by the time a goal is achieved that they put in motion years before, they're well on to the next thing and are not really present to celebrate because the weaving never ends. And this is one of the pieces I just wanted to name, that to become part of a landscape, to be a living part of the landscape, is what we're really ultimately talking about. Notice that this means becoming indigenous, except without naming it, so people don't get scared off. But it's actually really an important part of this. And what Commonland has figured out, really what Willem Verweerde figured out, is that the big problem is the way things are funded. Is projects are funded, but processes are not. And they needed to find a way to show people that the project is the process. And the core team is the manifestation and the living out of the process. And so you fund whatever projects at any given time to maintain the process of developing and evolving the projects. And so that was just something I wanted to name really quickly. And I got to go and answer a phone call, so forgive me for diving in and dashing out. But Benji, great job, man. Good stuff.
Thanks. No apology necessary. Send our love to Willem. I don't know if anybody would like to respond to what Joe had to say. I have something I could say, but I think I've said enough for a little bit, if at all possible. All right. Poem, did you have something or no?
Not really. I just noticed my mic is on there. I don't know if you guys are getting background noise here, but
No, you're good.
No.
You're good.
I guess since I'm talking, I'll just say that I really resonate with the idea of the core team being being part of the landscape, how necessary that is. And this idea that it requires some form of reintegration. You know, a lot of the work that you've been doing, even though sort of on your last sort of journey, you weren't becoming part of that landscape, but that process of learning and like talking to people, you know, the more we do that and live in a place, it's like the more we start getting integrated and understanding what that place actually is.
Yeah, yeah. Amity, I see your hand. If you don't mind, I'd love to just say something really briefly in response to Poem and Joe, and that is, you know, we in this virtual space, I think it's so easy for us to get lost in concepts. And what I heard from Joe and what I heard from you, Poem, and also, you know, I talked to Joel Krieger as much as I possibly can, and we spoke a little bit this week about this presentation and about Commonland. And he's an experienced designer, an amazing storyteller. He has a beautiful podcast. Does anybody know the name of it? Outsiders, something or other?
Outside In.
Outside In. Thank you. Yeah. If anybody hasn't checked it out yet, he did a couple episodes on Earth Regenerators, one on Joe actually, and what's happening in Barichara, but totally worth checking out. Anyways, we were talking about the value of telling stories simply. But when we're lost in conceptual space and abstraction, it's hard. What I'm hearing from Poem and Joe is once we're on the ground and we experience it, we gain the ability to speak it simply, but also with the nuance. So just to emphasize the need to get on the ground. It's all about being on the ground. Meaty, sorry. Love to hear from you.
Thanks, Benji. I'd love to weave in a few thoughts from elsewhere in the ER field. You mentioned, first of all, several times during your presentation, the importance of pro-social. And so I just wanted to put out, and can say more on Friday to anyone who's interested, that at the weekend, we're calling together any of the ER pro-social facilitators who are ready to host and hold the next learning journey in ER, which the date of which is to be decided and by them. All is emergent, but we'd love to keep the rhythm that Joe has established so beautifully in past learning journeys, if only as a tribute to his legacy. And we're going to be framing the learning journey around really grounding the core design principles that pro-social speaks to, and that we talk about very often in different parts of ER. We're really hoping to say, what does this mean in terms of ER? Where are we? How are we doing against the core design principles as a community and a network? And where do we need to focus more attention as a community network? And more, I'm seeing in ER this being the place where we've got our training wheels on, and we can experiment and we can prototype and actually practice what we preach in an ER bioregional way that then strengthens us when we go out into our physical territories. And so a kind of living, I feel that over the months that and actually years now that I've been in ER, a core team has developed, and it needs to maybe know itself better, because it's that I think the core is actually really well distributed. I see Benji as a crucial part of the core. And I see many others in the field holding that core team space. So it'll be wonderful if we can actually, as part of the learning journey process, really identify who counts themselves as as part of the core team within ER. I think that would be beautiful to do. I wanted to weave in also something from our current book club journey, because I think what's been going on in book club is really valuable to the culture of ER, and not everybody needs to be in book club for that influence and effect to be felt. But there was a beautiful part in this last week's session where we were looking at a Cree story of the 4 mountains. And the 4 mountains are the Baby Mountain, the Warrior Mountain, the Hunter Provider Mountain, and the Elder Mountain. And basically we were exploring on which mountain or mountains are we, and pretty quickly we concluded that we might be on any one of the mountains at any particular time. But whenever I hear the kind of time frame that I've heard in this presentation, and which I deeply hold to, and it resonates with my being, of a time horizon of 20 years or more, that's a signal to me that I need to see at least part of my time on the Elder Mountain, because one of the characteristics of the Elder Mountain is that you are not in your body when you reach the top of the Elder Mountain. You are in spirit. And that helps me to know that whatever I'm doing, wherever I'm being in these longer term processes, I won't be in body to see their fruition, but I will be around in spirit if I've played my part. And then finally, I just want to name a process which some of us were party to in the project incubator last night. We were part of the land as it held 2 of our beloved members of the ER community, as they shared with us. You know, Penny once gave the kind of the role modeling for this. Penny came and she was Penny, just Penny, in all her beauty and all her vulnerability. And oh my goodness, it's not that long ago, Penny, but wow, what has elapsed since? And 2 of our lovely ER members, Kath and Andy, came last night, and they shared with us their vulnerability and the beauty in their humanity. And something magical happened in that meeting, just as it happened in Penny's meeting. And I really trust that out of that magical collective experience, something very strong and powerful is going to emerge that will touch us all in the field. So I think I've said enough. Benji, it's wonderful to see your energy and your enthusiasm. It's so great to see you so fully alive and looking outward again. And thank you for what you're holding here. I hope if you're free, I can't remember whether you're a pro-social train facilitator or not, but whether you are or not, you're part of the core. So I hope you can come along on Saturday morning, because you're a key piece of whatever is trying to unfold. Thank you very much for listening, everybody.
Thank you, Meaty. Just let me know the time, I'll be there. And I am feeling like I've got some energy. Thanks for noticing. Yeah. Vivek, and then Claire.
Hey, I hope you can hear me okay. I just want to thank you for providing this perspective on the Commonland group, because I had actually taken a class maybe 2 years ago, which was by them, but I wanted to invite for holding this perspective around like that perspective, what you've shared around this core team, and then like there may be this other side of them that really has stressed around like finding a model, a business model or something. Because that when I learned some things from them a couple of years ago, I didn't hear much about the core team part. I heard more about the business model part. So it's like I'm wondering how we understanding partnerships with this group or et cetera, or just understanding who they are, like how to hear the multiple perspectives within them, for example. So like, I think we're hearing the Willem Verwerda side, but there's also another key person there, I think whose name is like Simon Molinar, who I think does a lot more on the business model stuff. So just kind of inserting that there for thought, because it's been interesting to hear two sides of this organization.
Yeah, definitely. And then there's somebody named Dieter Van Broek, I believe his name is. He's Dutch, and he, I think, is the one who is stewarding the Forward Turns Labs, and they're working closely with the Presencing Institute and Theory U. And I think that's where the central focus around the core teams lies, facilitating grassroots emergence and how this team comes together. And it's an interesting point. I haven't found anything in any of the Commonland documentation or literature about the core team. I've only heard about the core teams from Joe and from Willem Verwerda in interviews. I've heard him mention the core team and how important it is. And I kept wondering why is this, they have all these beautiful models and diagrams of things, but why is the core team absent from those? And maybe it has something to do with what Joe said earlier. Yeah, I think this is part of our investigation. Hopefully we'll figure that out as time goes forward. Hey again, Joe. Is there anybody else that would like to comment on that before we move on to Claire? Joe?
Just want to comment briefly on what happens when the real story isn't what you find in the documents. Because this happens a lot, which is that what Willem had to figure out was how to get, and he said he was so beautifully articulate about this in Spanish with the local people in Barichara. He said people in cities are idiots. They don't know anything about ecology. They're stupid. And they're like functionally autistic when it comes to ecological thinking. And he knows this because he used to try and get rich people to give money for conservation. And so he said, I love them. They're sweet, dear people, but they're idiots. And he said, in what way are they idiots? They have no clue how nature actually works. And so he had to find a way to translate to those people how to participate in these large-scale projects. And what he found was there was a mental model, which is large-scale infrastructure projects. You're going to put an intercity rail between two cities. You're going to budget for 20 years or longer for several $1 billion with a team that manages the implementation. You see the language, the maps over. And that's because as an ecologist, he knew how to create a translation that was functionally dumb and yet allowed them to do everything they needed to do on the ground. And that wasn't an accident. That was a bridge. And so I just want to name that this is part of the subtlety of really effective communication, is those documents weren't written for people like us. Documents written for people like us would be more like the way we talk. And I just want to name that because that's actually a really important part of Willem's brilliance. I mean, he like wears a suit and looks really like legit, and he's friends with billionaires, and you're like, what the hell? But if you hiked with him like I did here in Barichara, he's like a little kid with his little magnifying glass, stopping at every tree to look at the insects. He's a bug guy, he's a plant guy, he's a biologist. And so he just cleans up well because he's Dutch and he grew up in the city. But I want to name that because it's really an important part of this work of weaving is being a chameleon with integrity. To be a chameleon with integrity, to look different to different people, where the core of what you're doing is always authentic. When he speaks to those business people and those investors, he's being authentic, but he's using their language. And that's because there's a correspondence, a direct correspondence between what they fund and what gets done on the ground. But when they have to translate it back into language that they'll understand, and I remember attending one of their calls about the 4 returns as regenerative finance measurements for their project in Spain, 80% of it was around financial return, because that's what the questions were from the audience. That wasn't what was presented. Because they didn't understand social capital, they didn't understand ecological capital, but they understood financial returns, so that's what they asked about. And so I just wanted to name that because that's a really important part of this. And why it's so important to know the people personally, to actually get to know them and to see how they work is really, really an important piece of this. So just wanted to name that. Sorry to jump in out of sequence. I'll step back again.
No, that was great. That was so informative, Joe. Thank you. And I just posted, for anybody who's curious, to see a little bit more of Willem's side when he's not wearing his suit. I posted the interview with Daniel Christian-Wall. It's really great. And so then let's move on to, unless there's somebody who would like to respond to what Joe just brought in, because that was so informative.
Just to say, I think chameleon is something that middle space has to cultivate. Learning how to use different language according to who you're trying to communicate with, and recognizing that, you know, communication is about the flow, and it's all very well for me to talk in my language, but if it's not getting through to the other end of the flow, then I might as well be silent. Thank you.
Yeah. Claire.
Yeah, well, yeah, just grateful that you brought that in there, Joe, but maybe I'll just start with one of the things there were a few pieces. One was just, we've had this conversation in Earth Regenerators around people stepping into roles like facilitator roles, and maybe not having a good foundation in pro-social, and how that can actually affect the culture that you're cultivating, and just sort of that conversation about Elise. Yeah, so and you know, one of the things that I know that I've struggled with is how do you, when you're working with a group of people, work in a pro-social way when the culture, the predominant culture is actually has no clue about pro-social. And what I've noticed is that there isn't a critical mass, or there isn't really a core team. And this is what I found that I can't do. So working basically in the community art space, and community art, it's like the art's kind of part of it. It's much more about the social process. Yeah, unless I've got a core group of others who get that and can hold that, it's really, really difficult. So I just wanted to speak to how critical the core team is to be able to do that. And yeah, sort of introducing pro-social. The other piece I wanted to pick up on that you had talked about was defining what the bioregion is along like the ecological coherence of a whole landscape system. And one of the things that you know, I've just been in Maine for the bioregional learning journey, but there wasn't a full emphasis on like, what is this as a whole ecological system? And so there was an incident that came up, and I think it's just worth mentioning the detail of it, because it just helps illustrate what I was finding difficult, was that we hadn't spent time looking at like, what are the general boundaries? And it's always going to be fuzzy. So I understand that, and it's always going to change a little bit with the more, the richer the stories are. But there's a general sense of what makes us a whole system. And so there was this piece around the lobster fishing And at the boundary where it became federal jurisdiction as opposed to state, the lobster fishermen would have to throw back into the water anything that was over a certain size, because it was part of the succession, the ecological coherence of what they were doing. And yet on the federal, where the boundary was, they could go and fish like these huge lobsters and take, I think, up to 500, but they were doing it consistently. So when the state, under the state jurisdiction, so the local fishermen were basically sacrificing by throwing the lobster back, and yet people from outside of the state and not like under federal license could go and undermine it. And so they'd gone back and forth, and there was all kinds of like animosity and what have you. But unless you've got the conversation of, we're talking about an entire ecological system, it makes no sense to do that. That then gives a framework for having a conversation where they haven't been able to even have that conversation, because it just ends up with everybody getting angry about their jurisdiction. And yeah, I don't know if I've told the story well enough for it to come across, but it's like, how do you change the conversation? The only way to change the conversation is if you start talking about it in different terms. It's not on human, how we've organized ourselves on a human scale. So there was that. And then the last piece I just wanted to bring in was, I think, just as far as the funding of the core team, it's so incredible to have the model of Commonland and to even have some case studies of this is what it can look like. And talking about chameleoning your language and holding the integrity is, you know, I think it would be good to do the storytelling of what it is we're trying to do, but in a way that pitches it as this is a project we'd love you to invest in, so that those with money can hear it. Because if it's in language that they can't hear, they've got no interest in it. But there are lots of people who are talking about, you know, wanting to do something that's effective. But if it's not told in their language, they're not going to hear it. So I just think this is an incredible opportunity to marry the work we're trying to do in our own bioregions with the story of Commonland, but really get that storytelling down and know that we're chameleoning ourselves to reach those other groups. So that's.
Yeah, great. So chameleoning may be one of our new words. Yeah, Media already wrote it down. Okay, right. I think we're committed. It's official. Does anybody want to respond to Claire before we move on to Chad? No? Okay. I think all of that was really important stuff. Yeah, just to respond really quickly, Claire, I've read, I think in Regenesis group, that whenever there is just so much complexity and there's differences that can't be reconciled, increase the scale that you're looking at the problem through. And that just opens up so much and allows people to communicate more effectively and yeah, provides new perspective. And over to Chad, sorry with the superlative, but that's like the coolest shirt I've ever seen.
Cool. This is my newest.
I like it a lot.
Yeah. I guess it reminds you of the Rockies, huh?
It does.
Or the Andes, perhaps. Yeah. Yeah. So thank you for all this. You know, as I've begun to look into Commonland and their approach, I've been wondering how it translates into both the context of ER and the context of place. Obviously, Bioregional. And one thing that brings up is this bit about translation. So as a model, it's not something to be imposed, but actually to find connection with ongoing activities. So if Barichara hadn't had ongoing activities and a deep web of connection already, it wouldn't be an attractive place. But what that means is you're not imposing a model, but sort of adapting it to circumstance. So it's less a model than a heuristic. And so one thing to consider, maybe Joe can speak to this, is as that translation moves into Barichara, one of the core activities is the receipt of funds through the Territorial Foundation, which is a membrane and translator for funding, but also meaning and language. So there are lots of things that could be said about that. Like, for example, the 3 zones approach. Is that something, like, to what degree is that a way to justify delineations to funders versus actually to create something that people in the place will understand as what they're working through? But also, so in terms of the core team, right? So raises the question of the core team. So what's the connection between the core team and the Territorial Foundation? Are those going to be comprised of the same people? If so, how is there going to be a distinction of roles? And so forth. So I see a hand up in the Joe Penny box. So
Well, Penny had her hand up, but I'd love to just respond before she goes, if that's okay.
Yeah.
What Commonland has found in their experience is that every landscape they work within, with one exception, after forming their landscape plan or somewhere in that period of time, they created a territorially focused nonprofit. So in the Altiplano of Spain, it was about 6 months after they started the process that they created a nonprofit. That was basically the institutional home for this landscape work. And the one exception was a landscape where there was an existing organization that had a mission alignment, and they chose to adopt that organization rather than create a new one. But it's important to note that in every case, an organization was either formed or was adapted. And so what we're doing with the Territorial Foundation, like Willem's wife, Petra, who is this amazing woman, she was an architect and now she's an elementary school teacher, which shows she's just getting smarter as she goes. She was this brilliant woman. And she was like, at one point when I was explaining what we're doing, she said, he's talking about what Commonland does. Like we were already doing it. It was the thing. It's not like, oh, now that we're going to work with Commonland, we're doing it. It's like, no, we can work with Commonland because they can tell a global narrative about all these landscapes, with each landscape telling their own story from their own local perspective, because they have a local team that can tell it. And so this piece is really, really important. And what I think we're going to find is that the core team is going to be people who are in Barichara, at least, they are in the Territorial Foundation in some way, but they'll move around within the ecosystem of what the Territorial Foundation manages. So right now, our core team is mostly in the syntropic agroforestry work, but they also do everything else. And then there are others who are like, I don't have time to do the syntropic agroforestry part, but I'm helping gestate these social impact businesses in agroforestry from our other work. Yes, I'm talking about Carlos, Chad knows who I'm talking about. That is not part of the syntropic agroforestry work. And so we end up with this small set of people who are deeply interwoven with each other. And they use the institutional frameworks to coordinate themselves. And most importantly, to coordinate a coherent story out to the outside world. So they cultivate through convening and mapping the coherent local story, and then they tell it to the outside world, and no one comes in unless they match that filter. Someone who resonates with that story will help it, including Commonland. So it goes both ways. Commonland doesn't ever enter a territory. A group of people convenes the landscape team, and then they invite Commonland to walk the path with them. And the secret of Commonland is that they never approach a landscape. They only go where they're invited. And so I invited Willem for 3 years. Because of the pandemic, it took this long for him to come. And when he came, he was like, wow, if you guys are ready, I was like, oh yeah, our team needs to ask for Commonland. So what Willem said when we had beers the last night he was here was, you've got an amazing team here. These guys are incredible. And if they want to work with Commonland, you're the best position in Colombia. Notice he didn't say, we want to work with you. It's like, if you guys want to work with us because you think it's valuable to you, we're ready because we see you're ready. And that's the way it always is with them. So I just want to name that piece that they operate by being asked out on a date. And until they're asked out on a date, they don't dance. And so there's no outside imposition. They've decolonized their process, but in a way that's so subtle, people just think they're a foundation with lots of money, which actually they're not anymore. They've already allocated all their money to all the landscapes they work with. But they're an incredible partner for storytelling and alliance building, which is what they're going to do with us. And so just wanted to name a couple of those nuances. And then I know Penny had something to say, so I'll pass it back to you.
Actually, I'm gonna just, I'm gonna maybe go after Poyam, if that's all right.
No problem. I just wanted to, I was having some audio issues. I wanted to talk about something that Claire brought up, which was around the defining the bioregion. That I think that can be tricky to think about, because I'm, at least speaking for myself, not so used to thinking of landscapes at that scale. And when you start to talk about, you know, ecologies and sort of ecological sort of territory of species, it can get muddy. And if you look in sort of the history of sort of bioregionalism, the term is used differently than it is in ecology. When people talk about different ecotones and things like that. And so I think one of the main differences between, I think, again, speaking for myself, when I think about what I mean when I say sort of operating bioregionally or some kind of like bioregionalism frame perspective, it's different because we're talking about people in addition to the other ecological species, the non-human people. And so there's like a cultural piece of it that's important too. You know, I often tend to think about it in terms of watersheds, but I don't think that's always the case, you know, especially if you look at like the Cascadia bioregion. There are some of this like sub bioregions within Cascadia are, you know, these coastal watersheds that are very tiny. And I mean, you could talk about some bioregionalism in this very tiny watershed, but it makes a lot of sense to group them together because they're dealing with very similar issues. They have very similar environment. They affect each other, even though the water's not connected. So, and then to add on top of all of that, there's this porousness that Claire sort of alluded to, that even when we're talking about a bioregion, the deer cross over the ridge line and humans travel between, you know, major trade centers and different things like that. So I don't have I find that difficult, not only for myself to grapple with, but then especially in describing it to people. Most people I talk to, I'd say, oh, I'm working in the Sacramento River watershed, and they have no idea what that means. A lot of people that I talk to. So I think people just aren't aware of landscape. They're just not aware of the place that they live, most people.
Do you mind if I respond to you, Poyam?
Please do.
So, you know, like if you just think about the human body, like where do I end? Do I end like Nora Bateson's question is at the end of, is it at where my skin ends? Or is there bacteria and stuff that, and what about my, you know, the air that I breathe? So as a body, like we are a whole system that actually can't be, you can't just take away my liver, or you can't just take away, so there's things that are coherent, and yet there are fuzzy boundaries, and we've got, you know, we're too limited if we think that we end at our skin. So the thing is that we as humans have defined things according to what we wanted. And if you don't look at this coherently makes sense. In fact, the health of the entire system fails if we don't look at it as an entire system that we need to pay attention to as a system. And so it's more like it's a lens that we look through. Like holding it lightly is really important. But I think that incoherence about the lobster thing, like as soon as you put it into a bigger context, it makes absolutely no sense. Like it's incoherent. And yet the focus of energy is on the incoherence and trying to sort that out. And it's like, it'll never make sense because you're using the wrong lens. And so it's like more like, how do we flip how we see and organize ourselves? And that's how, like, to me, that's where the power of bioregionalism actually is really important. Anyway, that's.
And I see Meady's hand. I think she'd love to respond to Claire. And then I just wanted to leave just a few minutes for Penny as well. She's been waiting patiently.
I actually want to respond to Claire, but also to really strongly what I hear Poyam speaking to, because I so resonate with what he's saying. And I'm sensing that there are some landscapes that are incredibly difficult to identify. But when Poyam speaks to, the small watershed, I can easily identify with my small watershed. I've virtually walked it. I know the organizations that are active. I know the groups to go to. I know where I can plug in tomorrow to clean a creek, etc., etc. It becomes nonsense as soon as I really look at this as a functional landscape, although there is a functional watershed management plan, because right on our doorstep is this 15 million people conurbation metropolis. And it's like when Poyam was talking the other day about the lake that actually feeds San Francisco. You can't think of the landscape without thinking about San Francisco. As soon as you speak to San Francisco or Los Angeles, you are talking landscape on a macro scale, because the landscape of Los Angeles or the landscape of San Francisco plugs into very directly other places. So I think we probably need to grapple, Poyam and I need to go on grappling with what is the meaning of landscape in these challenging kind of territories, where it may be relatively easier in Cascadia, it may be relatively easier in Barichara, because there is the ecosystem aspect that is not overwhelmed by these huge human metropolis. So I really resonate with what Poyam was speaking to. It's my living challenge. What is my bioregion here? What makes functional sense? And I haven't found the answer yet. And it sounds like Poyam hasn't either. Thank you.
Penny, you want to take us home?
Well, I have 2 minutes, so let's see. I was going to speak to what Claire said somewhat, and also like after when you did your presentation, Claire, a couple weeks ago with the person in the, I can't remember what it's
Brandy
called.
Gallagher.
Yeah. Yeah, I was asking Joe, so how did you find the people who were thinking at a landscape scale or at a bioregional scale? And so I just wanted to bring this in because he actually didn't look for that. He looked for people who were taking action, like the people who are actually doing things, who are doing projects in the area. And then what he did is he brought them together into the advisory council, but with like some money. It was like $5,000.
Yeah, 30 million Colombian pesos.
30 million Colombian pesos, and said, to all these people, we need to find the best use of this for the territory. And so that was what drew them together. That's what brought them together to actually come together and see each other, and they started to see each other and see what everybody was doing and work together to apply that money out. So it was like they weren't actually necessarily thinking at a landscape scale, but they started to when they came together and they had a reason to be together and they had a goal that they needed to do together. So I wanted to bring that in as a way that you could start a conversation if you have a shared goal that everybody, that's compelling enough that it'll bring them all together.
Yeah, and just to add to that, two things. One, Paula wrote a nice summary of this process as a case study for an R3.0 report on governance and finance. So Paula did a nice job. You guys should check it out whenever it's ready. The other thing is that I think everyone was pretty incredulous, meaning they didn't really believe in the scale I was talking about. And then what's gradually happened is after a year and a half, almost 2 years of this just growing organically, the way organic things do, where now they believe that they must go to the territorial scale because nothing less will work. But it's not like I found the people who believed. I just found the people who get shit done. And they weren't talking to each other. And the way I got them to talk to each other, I'll be there in just a second, sweetie, was I said, here's this money. Be sure it's not spent badly. What is the best use of this? And they created their criteria and their priorities. And I said, the scale is the territory. They said, what's the scale of the territory? I said, well, it's about 500,000 hectares, the regional climate system. Why do you say that? Oh, I studied cloud formation and I saw the pattern. And also this is the ancestral lands of the indigenous Guane people. I'm like, oh, okay. Joe's saying something that kind of makes sense, but no one's thinking at that scale. So I just wanted to name this, that it wasn't like I found the bioregionalists. We cultivated ourselves as bioregionalists by doing things in a territorial patterning. And that difference is huge. So I just want to name that. Okay, sweetie, I'm coming.
All right, wow. Great insight to end with, I think. And just kind of beginning to brainstorm where we go from here. Sorry, I know we're a couple minutes over. If anybody has to leave for any prior obligation, feel free. But yeah, just to close, looking ahead, love to hear from Poyam in his Story of Place, his project, if he's ready next week or the week following or whenever you would be. And then I'm going to begin brainstorming what we do next in terms of the Bioregional Weaver Guild workshop. Maybe it's this, maybe we can find a few core teams that have formed and hear their stories and facilitate a conversation. Something like that. I don't know, just thinking, just throwing that out there. If anybody has any ideas, I would love to hear them. Throw them in the chat underneath the post that I'll put out tomorrow or the next day with the recording and the reflections from this session. Love to get a conversation going there and do this collaboratively if we can. So yeah, in closing, you know, we started with what have you learned recently? I just want to close in gratitude for all that I've learned today. I've learned a ton. That was great. I love when that happens, and I hope y'all feel similarly. So thank you for coming and enabling that. And it's great to see all your beautiful faces. Megan, good to meet you. Lene, not sure. Thanks for stopping by. Everybody else, good to see you. Paula, I haven't seen you in a while. Good to see you. And we'll see y'all soon. Take care.